Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Prep 8, Audience Analysis. Now, this is probably the second most important thing that we are going to learn about this year in this class. Isn't that pretty crazy? If you're wondering what the first most important thing is, I believe it's windows and mirrors, right? Is that we want to be authentic with our audience. Well, to understand audience analysis, we need to look no further than, drumroll please, Starbucks! Isn't this a great picture? I took this picture, by the way, a couple summers ago. Believe it or not, Starbucks coffee has done more than just change the way you look at the UC or the Bovie Center where this picture was taken, right? It's actually changed the industry as a whole. What Starbucks was able to do was target a whole new audience of coffee drinkers, so much to the fact that it spilled over into other companies' audiences as well. And so even though Starbucks was targeting a very specific audience, which we'll talk about here at the end of this prep, what ended up happening was people started to catch on and they liked what Starbucks was doing. And so different coffee places like Dunkin' Donuts started losing business. And this case study that we're about to learn about is really essential to understanding audience analysis. And I hope that once this prep is over, it will make sense. If it doesn't, please let me know because I am curious kind of what you're thinking. This is what I call a tale of two audiences. This is a commercial from Dunkin' Donuts that really explains why audience analysis is so important. Like I said, Starbucks coffee actually started to spill over into Dunkin' Donuts business. So Dunkin' Donuts had to get their audience back. So how did they do it? Well, they did it through audience analysis, but more specifically, this really funny commercial. Let's watch this.
Ocho, half cap, latte, chino, mocha, duet, avec moi. My mouth can't form these words. My mind can't find these words. Is it French or is it Italian? Perhaps Fritalian.
Delicious lattes from Dunkin' Donuts. You order them in English, not Fritalian. America runs on Dunkin'.
All right, so kind of comical, kind of funny, but I think this commercial really serves as a good example of what audience analysis can do for you. Let's look at the very first part of audience analysis. Now, there's 4 parts to audience analysis, and it's imperative that you write down everything that's on this Prezi. So if you have to pause this video, it's okay. This is like the cornerstone to everything that you're going to do in this speech, the next speech, and your last speech. So you want to make sure you really understand your audiences. So the first piece of information we look at is demographic info. Now, what's important is we look at things like the age range, the sex makeup. Are we talking about all men, all women? Is there a mix of both? The educational level that the person is at. So do they have a high school diploma? Do they have a bachelor's and master's? And then finally, what type of occupation are we looking at? The reason why this is all important is because this tells you things about your audience. And specifically, it's going to tell you about the next 3 parts of audience analysis. So this is kind of like the foundation to audience analysis is you always want to start with the demographic info. So there are 2 tips here. The first one is you always want to keep the age range tight, okay? So the reason why there's less of a disparity between 12 and 16 and 18 to 25 is because between 12 and 16, ages 12 and 16, there's a huge gap, right? I mean, between 12 and 16, a lot changes, and I won't go through that. 18, 25, less changes, but the point is that you want to try to keep your age range as tight as possible, so you're really targeting a very specific audience, as we'll see in Dunkin' Donuts commercial in just a second. Number 2, you want to try to pick similar audiences, okay? So they want to have a few things in common, like similar education. They all have a bachelor's degree. They all recently graduated college. They're all possibly new parents. They're all in white-collar jobs. They're all in blue-collar jobs. Gosh, I sound so silly when I say that. I feel like William Shatner. Takes me an hour to finish the sentence. Okay, you get the point. So the reason why we want to keep things tight and we want to try to keep our audiences similar is so that way we can really target a specific group of people. Because what you'll find is, in fact, movies do this really poorly, is they try to target too many audiences. And so if you remember the movie Pearl Harbor from the early 2000s, late 90s, I can't remember exactly when it was, it tried to target too many people. And so the historians hated it because it wasn't necessarily accurate and there wasn't that much history to it. People that like romantic comedies didn't like it because... just romantic movies in general didn't like it because the love story was just kind of like, it kind of didn't really fit. And then, of course, people who like action movies were kind of like, well, the action was like 5-10 minutes. So what ends up happening is if you pull Pearl Harbor, you try to get too many audiences and thus you get nobody. So let's see how Dunkin' Donuts did. All right, so as you look at this audience, you can see that we do have similar audiences. We can take a guess and say this is probably 35 to 45. They're working class individuals, both men and women, at least a high school degree, maybe some college degree. Again, it's hard to tell. In fact, you might even argue that there's both white and blue collar jobs here. It might have been better if they just focused on one, but I really think that they were trying to reach the blue collar individual, male or female, who's got a working class job. They're in the grind every single day, and they just need a cup of coffee, right? So this really plays into what? The knowledge level. So when you get to the knowledge level, this is what I want you to include. Specifically, what do they know about the topic, and why do you think they know this about the topic? And so remember that this really tells you how to organize your speech. So you want to make sure that if they have knowledge about what something is, you do not tell them what this topic is in the first main point, okay? But if they don't have knowledge about what this is, then you want to tell them in the main point. So you tailor your audience to the organization. The reason why I say that you tailor your audience to the organization and not backwards is because you've already probably picked your organization, so now you want to make sure that you tailor it to the right audience. And in most speeches, you'll do the opposite. You'll tailor your organization to the audience, but we're working backwards because I wanted you to get the organization down first. All right, so the second tip is you want to make sure the knowledge level of this audience changes the language that you use. So in other words, we have to pull a Nelson Mandela and speak to people through their heart, okay? Now, Nelson Mandela was really famous because he said that if you speak to a man or woman in a language they understand, it goes to their head, okay? But if you speak to a man or woman in their own language, it goes to their heart. And that's what we want to do. We want to speak to this audience in their own language. So you want to use examples that they would be familiar with, right? In this case, guess what? There's nothing worse than walking into a coffee shop and you don't know how to order a coffee. When Starbucks first opened, it was right by my folks' house, and so it was like a half a mile walk, so I would sometimes walk over there, get a cup of coffee, and I used to have a heart attack every time I walked in there. Now, I was in high school. I had no idea what the sizes were. I had no idea how to order a drink, but I thought, oh my God, this is the coolest place in the world. Well, if I was a working class individual, I would be terrified to walk into a Starbucks. I would know right away that I am completely in the wrong place. And so Dunkin' Donuts is saying, hey, we know how it feels to walk into a coffee shop where you don't know how to order a coffee. So don't worry, you don't have to know for Italian. You just have to know you like coffee and we're going to serve you. So you see how the demographic information fed into the knowledge level? That's the key. You want to make sure the demographic leads you to understanding not only what they know, but also how to speak to them. So again, I kind of talked about this, and I think this is kind of interesting. If you look at this, this is kind of the joke, right? You don't walk into a Starbucks, you don't see this kind of language, but it feels that way. Whereas Dunkin' Donuts is like, I'm a working class American man or woman, and all you need to know is that there's a small, a medium, a large, and I need a big one because I am tired and I want to wake up. The whole idea is that Dunkin' Donuts was really smart. And again, we talked about this in the last slide, so I won't go into this any further. Dunkin' Donuts knew their audience's language. All right, so now once we know who the audience is, what they know, now we can figure out whether they're favorable to the topic or not. And so when we talk about favorability, it's pretty much how they feel about a topic or their stance on it, right? So for instance, think about it like this. You know people that are not favorable to Donald Trump. You know people who are not favorable to Hillary Clinton. There's reasons why they're not favorable to either one of those presidential candidates, but we do know that they just dislike them. And so favorability is like is a feeling about the topic, like I do not like this topic. Now here's where it gets interesting. In an informative speech, your audience is favorable to what you have to say. Now in a persuasive speech, it's actually the opposite. In a persuasive speech, you want your audience to not be favorable to what you're saying because you want to persuade them. So remember in the last prep when I talked about how the why how speech could be considered persuasive? It's not persuasive as long as your audience is favorable to the topic, because they're favorable to the idea that whatever they're doing is hurting them in some way, and so they want information on how to change it. That makes it informative speaking. However, if they're not favorable to it, then that's persuasive speaking. All right, so obviously we know this is persuasive because we know that the audience is not favorable to being treated like an idiot when they order a cup of coffee. And so in many ways, this was actually a persuasive ad. And let's face it, all commercials are persuasive because they're trying to get our attention. So they know you're not favorable to Starbucks, and so they want to use that to their advantage. All right, so the last piece of information and the most important part is the connection piece. And this is how much the audience trusts and believes that you are actually like them. It's also the likability factor. So not only is their credibility at stake, but also do they like you? And so a couple tips is, number one, is you want to walk the walk and talk the talk. We kind of talked about this already in the in the knowledge level using the language, okay? But 2 is that, again, you want to use specific examples from their life, okay? So remember, let's go back to our lovely commercial. The idea is that there's a language barrier. And so how did Dunkin' Donuts connect with the working class American? They said, hey, we know what it feels like to have to order something in for Italian, but when you come to Dunkin' Donuts, you can order it in English. I mean, that's an example from the audience's life. Now, we'll talk a little bit more in class on how to make this connection with your audience. There's a lot of different ways you can do it, and we'll talk about that. But this is obviously a perfect example of walking and talking, walking the walk and talking the talk. All right, so A Tale of Two Coffees. Like I said, we've got 2 different audiences, right? So take a look at Dunkin' Donuts, right? We know the type of workers we see there. They're usually kind of like, older folks. I have the male here, kind of stereotypical. This was kind of like the spokesperson. If you notice, the voice in the Dunkin' Donuts ad was actually John Goodman. The audience would really appreciate that. Whereas at Starbucks, you've got this young, hip barista, maybe a hipster. They're laughing, they're smiling, they're having a great time. They look hip, they look cool. We probably want to be like them. And most importantly, they got these crazy names. So what Starbucks did to make themselves different than every other coffee shop is they made people feel like they were getting an experience. They made people feel like they were going to a place where they were accepted, where they were loved, where they could feel cool, they could feel welcome, they could sit down and relax, and they weren't actually buying a cup of coffee. Instead, they were buying an experience. And that's why Starbucks was so successful. Because see, Dunkin' Donuts, McDonald's, all these other coffee places, they thought people were coming for the coffee. So that's exactly what they're selling. But Starbucks said, we can't charge a latte for a latte. Get it? We can't charge a lot of money for a cup of coffee if we call it a cup of coffee, because people aren't going to pay that much, but they will pay a lot more for an experience. And that's what makes audience analysis so important. If you know your audience, you can target to them, you can market to them, and you can get them to trust you and believe in you, but you have to know your audience. So I think the answer is yes, they do serve different audiences, and we will talk about this in class. All right, so when you're creating your audience, 2 things to keep in mind. You cannot have college students, and number 2, you have to use complete sentences when explaining your audience, and make sure that you use all the important tips I offered. So there's got to be a tight age range. You've got to make sure that you tell us why they have a certain knowledge level. Give us all the demographic information. How are you going to connect with them? All that stuff is there. People lose so many points on this, and it's so simple. So just follow this prep. Last but not least, some final notes. If you haven't yet, please sign up for your speech topic. Do that through the Google Doc, and that is available in the Speech 2 Help folder in Blackboard. I'm so excited to talk to you about this in class. I hope you're excited too. And go forward and realize that everything that's being marketed to you is based on audience analysis. So I hope this opens your eyes and helps you to realize how easy and sometimes difficult it can be to really target your audience, but also the importance of targeting them correctly, right? Because just like we learned in Pearl Harbor, if you try to target too big of an audience, you target nobody. All right, talk to you soon. Bye.